good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to be here, and I'm here with Ali Morelli from URI and with our morning presenters. This morning we have with us Kathy Service and attorney Mark Sjoberg. My name is Corinne Calisi-Russo, and we welcome you to this training series. We're here to welcome you to the third training presentation, which is part of the Management of Elder Behavioral Health Needs module, a course within Rhode Island Geriatric Education series. Today's topic is Risky Business, Understanding Mental Health Issues, Older Adults, and Decision Making. Our presenters today are Kathy Service and attorney Sjoberg. Prior to introducing our guest lecturers, I want to inform you that this series is supported by Rhode Island Geriatric Workforce Enhancement Program at the University of Rhode Island and CARE New England. This presentation will be recorded, and we want you to know that for confidentiality issues. During your question and answer period, we want you to know it will be recorded, and it will be available on the URI website. So I'd like to introduce to you first Kathy Service. Kathy has worked in the field of intellectual and developmental disabilities for over 40 years. First as a registered nurse, and since 1979 as a nurse practitioner. She has worked in both community and institutional settings. Much of Kathy's work has been with the Massachusetts Department of Developmental Services. As a PhD candidate at the University of Northumbria in Newcastle upon Tyne in England, her research is focused on the perception of risk in older people with ID and the relationship of their social networks. So I'd like to introduce to you Kathy Service. Thank you for being with us.
Hi everybody, and thank you for being here. And what I hope that this presentation, this workshop for me is really to start a dialogue with people, because risk really is a loaded topic. We all know about it and talk about it. In fact, you'll see later one of my slides, it's in the top 10% of words for the Merriam-Webster dictionary. In these 20 minutes, it's really too brief a time to really get into it. But what I want to give you is some thinking points, some ways of different thinking about risk, and also, moreover, into how people make decisions about things, and how we can support people through this. And most healthcare professionals, myself included, not only make judgments about acceptable evidence and consequential possibilities and probabilities. We think about these things. But we also think about what are the desirable outcomes, and as I was preparing this, I was thinking, well, whose desirable outcomes are we looking at? And we typically, and it's not, undervalue many preferences which individuals really have for themselves. And it happens when there's clear societal and oftentimes legal pressures to do so, and for certain outcomes to happen with people. And then there's also, and this is what will be interesting, having the attorney come and talk about some of the issues around when people are not capable or willing to make rational or acceptable choices or decisions. And many healthcare practitioners don't understand nor really value the alternate strategies for making decisions and are faced with struggles under dilemmas, doing what's right, and doing what's safe for people and enabling them to lead healthy and productive lives. So, next slide, Ali. Well, the next slide is really even helpful. So, it's what is risk? And what is risk? I like to think about the parable of the blind man and the elephant, because it's really, even though the elephant is a concrete, tangible thing, how one really perceives the elephant really sets a definition. Because when you have blind men, and the parable goes as, one blind man feels the tusk feels one thing, who feels like legs feel another thing, the tail thinks another thing. And this is what it really is about what we feel about risk. We look at things differently. So the next slide. So here's the infamous definition of risk, and what I really want to talk about is the possibility of loss or injury, and that's something that creates or suggests a hazard. It implies or really hints about choices, decision-making, and we talk about, it's the potential of gaining or losing something of value. It also can be defined as intentional interaction with uncertainty. In this world, we have so much uncertainty going on, and much of our lives, and much of our sort of efforts are trying to manage this. We're trying to get some control in our chaotic lives. So I think that this is our, choice making and decisions and uncertainty all have a lot of relevance in looking at what constitutes a risk and then how do people come to the right decisions. And next slide. And our changing, I think this is even complicated even more because our understanding it's really changed over time what risk is. And when I was working on my dissertation, I really was looking at a lot of different ways or lenses on how to look at risk. And it's really defined differently by a whole host of different disciplines. We have, people in the business world look at risk in one way, people in math, engineering, and even human services. So it really only adds to confusion what we as healthcare practitioners need to kind of work and support the people that we work with. Some key points about risk is that there's an uncertainty. There really is an uncertainty about potential outcomes. And that outcomes really do have to matter. And what we really do is kind of in our heads, and people that we work with and support really try to assign probabilities to outcomes. And these probabilities is based on experiences. And as I was thinking to myself, as I was writing this up and looking in the literature, it's like, well, what's experience? How do we come to these decisions? I mean, is it experience based upon what has happened to us in the past? Or is it experience about what we want? Is it experience about who we trust? And we're going to get into some issues a little bit more about trust and relationships. So I think we make a lot of calculations, we and the people that we work with. And then when we have people that may not have, have different ways of thinking, and it's hard for me when I talk about people with either intellectual and or developmental disabilities and people with mental health problems, people with dementia, that the rational part about thinking is not there. So how do we work with people to support them through this process? And it really is, and we know ourselves. I know when something changes, when we make decisions based on uncertainty, and we know ourselves if there's a change in our schedule, how for many of us it discombobulates and changes the way we're able to kind of write ourselves back up. But it can be disconcerting, and it can be also, it's a real challenge to us, and a real has to do with our sense of self-esteem and our sense of who we are as people. So, next slide, please. So some of the limits of rationality, and healthcare providers use scientific knowledge, and there's been a lot going on in the news about science and evidence, and I'm not meaning to cause any negative ideas about that, but I want us to kind of broaden our horizons in looking at this. And in fact, the scientific knowledge is based on evidence-based practice, and that's what we use a lot to assess and communicate risk to individuals. And what we hope to do is really to empower these people to make informed choices about risk and how they think about weighing risk-benefit, weighing burdens and benefit, so that they continue to have the best life as they can have. And healthcare practitioners are really trusted to provide this information, to make the informed choices. And it's hard because I think when we come out as healthcare practitioners, we're bringing the rational, we're bringing the science to people. My goodness, I shut my phone off too. It's all right. I think we are bringing these kind of objective, scientific kinds of principles to people. And it's really can be difficult because the other thing that I think that we overlook is what is our relationship to the individual. how do we establish trust? How are people going to, the person that we're partnering with is going to or even kind of consider what we have to say. Next slide. And we do know, and I know for ourselves and those of us in the field of healthcare, historically, people would make decisions, healthcare practitioners, based on clinical autonomy, and it's based upon tacit and other knowledge sources. And I know, even, other people, Carol, my mind is a little hazy on this, talks about women's ways of knowing, other ways of knowing, other ways of having knowledge about things. It's not always the scientific knowledge. There's other avenues of knowledge that to gather about people. So this is what I want for you to take, because we can't give prescriptions for every single person, because everybody's an individual. But I want you to kind of broaden your horizons about how people, even people with mental health issues, how they think about things and make decisions and think about what's risky to them. And we do know that currently our whole system, national guidelines, is based on the national guidelines, the review of available scientific evidence. And quite honestly, for some of the work, or much of the work we do, and I know for myself, especially lately I've been working a lot with dementia care and people with intellectual disabilities, what is the evidence? What is the scientific evidence out there? We have, I know a lot of, what we use in a lot of our work is talking about evidence-enhanced or evidence-informed information. So I think things like this need to inform us on how we support people with mental health, or any older person in general. And yet, Clancy talks about, there's an article in terms of the mental health system. It talks about the power differential. And, people do feel disempowered. I think many of the people we work with may not feel empowered, because lots of times they don't have the experience, and they don't have, they're not looking at measurement in terms of numbers. People can talk about percentage. I think we're a lot better now in the healthcare field when we talk about, how percentages and how, you can give a percentage of what this would happen, or a bad ill effect. But for real people in real life, what does that really mean for a person's quality of life? What does that mean for their lifestyle? What does that mean for the people they care about and who support them? But, so quite honestly, even if people write lists down, pros and cons, and we'll talk a little bit about different ways of making decisions, it's really hard, because there are a lot of social sort of influences and factors that come into play with this. And I think that we don't know a lot about what older people think about, especially people who may not have all of the intellectual capacity that a lot of people have without intellectual disabilities or mental health problems. And then you have the situation, if a person has transient, that their cognitive impairment may be transient because of a mental health disease. So that really complicates what we have to do with people. Next slide. And the reality is that in everyday life, people use and weigh different sources of information, not just instrumental rationality and scientific knowledge. Next slide. And this is, you can't really see this, and so I'll write it, but I can't help it. I found this cartoon, Foxtrot. And I don't know, does anybody know that cartoon? I mean, in my local newspaper, but it's a family. And this is with the oldest son, Peter, who's playing football, or is involved with the football team. And the coach, he's there with a pillow on his head, and the coach is asking him, well, what on earth are you wearing? He says, extra head protection. And then Peter says, with recent studies suggesting a line between football and permanent brain damage, I don't want to take any chances this season. And the coach says, well, I mean, I'm a coach and educator. I really share your concerns. However, you do realize you're the water boy, right? And Peter says, I like my brain. I'm sorry. So what it really, I mean, this is kind of silly, and I appreciate humor to kind of help to communicate things, but it really talks about, I mean, when we look at things and the people that we work with, these are the kinds of, understandings of life and everyday situations, that how people rationalize, and it may not be intellectual rationalization, their world. Next slide. So risk and decision-making. And, this talks about, there needs to be, when people are talking about risk, there's obviously implies an action to be taken. But also, decisions imply that they really are preferences and implies choices and or opportunities. And so we have to kind of look at what are the choices that people are getting. Also, what are the opportunities that they have when they're making these choices. And risk perception and cognition are really inversed in values. And I like this quote by Glendon, talks about a person evaluates risk like all other people, like some other people, like no other people. So I think we have to know the person as well as we can know the person, or gather the team of people around who tell them the person. We also need to consider subjective aspects of risk and also objective risk aspects. And there's issues around informed consent and risk, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. I'm just going to
Janet's gonna go get you some water here. Janet?
Okay, I have a drink right here. No problem. And choice and decision-making is integral to understanding risk perception and management. And there really is a dynamic interplay between ourselves and our society. That really, form perception that guide decisions. And one of the things I think about how so often that even those of us who may not have a mental health issue, who may, or different kinds of mental health issues, where do we go to get information and how do we make decisions? Who do we go to? And then, how do we come about making these decisions? So we talk about Andy Elasuski, who does a lot of work on, in fact, he was the Journal of Health Risk and Society. There's even a great journal that comes out of the UK on risk and health. And he talks about that the individual, the last one, is shaped by social context, the need for personal security, and the trust of the source. So I can't help but look at trust in relationships. And I think that even though we do talk about person-centered care, and I hardly agree with that, but I do know in the UK at least, and in gerontological nursing, they look at a little bit more about relationship-centered care and how do we use relationships to support each another. Next slide. And I appreciate this little, these boxes, or one that kind of talks about different kinds of strategies to manage risk. And we look about risk, rational strategies. How do we manage risk and uncertainty? We've talked about weighing pros and cons, looking at calculations, more sort of concrete, more calculations, the numbers, and how does that matter? And then in between, such as trust and intuition and emotion. And then there's non-rational strategies such as belief and hope. And how often do we, when we try to support people, consider those kinds of faith and strategies like that in terms of making decisions? So when people head towards a really unknown future, they really use a lot of different strategies. The other thing is that trust in others and other institutions are used, especially when individuals do not have the intellectual capacity, or they might have, or they think that others will do better. So they're not, and they may be on, they may think others will do better. Intuition and emotions are further resources which shape perception and responses for risk. Not so much rationality, but on the basis of pre-conscious knowledge or experience. So I think we have to kind of also think about all of these things. And then how do we manage negative outcomes? We talk about having healthcare insurance. We talk about looking at, other kinds of things like social networks, keeping us, helping us to manage, and some of the, the social networks that we have and the people that we support have. And then even another non-rational negative is avoidance and fate. And I know how many times do we use denial? Do we use things like throwing your fates up to the wind? So I think that this is another consideration for those of us in the field have to look at. Next. So the big issue that that came to me when I was working on my dissertation, was talking about trust. And how do we trust people? What is trust? And we know, nowadays, when we have so much about fake news out in the world, and who do you trust to get this information, all the scientific knowledge, but then we have a lot of social influences that affect us. What is trust? And it doesn't develop through information, but emotional involvement and sense making. So we have to kind of look at, how do we develop trust in people? So often, when I was working on my dissertation, but also just in terms of thinking about the people that I work with, and we know, time is a really important factor in how do we develop trust with each other. And, in our healthcare world, the way that things are going is that there's so limited time. We have so many conflicting demands based upon us that the time and even just the pause to be with a person and kind of getting a sense about who they are and all the important facets in their life is often we don't get to because it's such a rushed time. So I think one of the benefits that I had in my jobs over the years was having more time with people, so getting to know people. And it really is, the trust that people have with you, because many of the people that we work with and try to support have so many transient people in their lives. So who do they trust? I mean, especially when they can't intellectually figure out what's going on. So to build up these trusting relationships, or if you don't, one of the ways that I would think is to build like teams, and we talk about teams, or finding out who the relationships that this person has, and using them to help you to work with a person, to reach the person where you might not be able to reach the person. Next slide. So some everyday considerations is looking at how we reframe this, and understand how these different kinds of strategies combine. I know there's been so many times for me, it's like you may think, you have this sort of concrete, the numbers and stuff like that, but we also have our intuition based upon our knowledge, based upon a lot of personal experience in similar cases, in similar ways, and the people that we work with can also have had, memories and understandings about things. They may not always seem to make sense to us. Then we need to be able to listen to and help people and support them through this and try to figure out ways. And it's not easy, it's not quick. I think for me, the other thing is that this takes time, and we don't often have time when we work with people and support people. So we also need to be looking at how do we, what other strategies, what do people use when they come to make decisions about things? And again, it's very hard because when you have subjective information, who's to say that how much value it has, whether it's right or wrong, what has greater weight. And in the world, in most of the society, in the legal world, it's rationality. And I think that's a difficult thing, and I understand that. But I also, maybe we can kind of look at some of these other ways of understanding people's worlds in terms of making decisions. So one of the things that, and I remember when I was doing my dissertation, I spent a lot of time, it's more like ethnography, and I spent time with people, older people with intellectual disabilities. And I went to the supermarket with a man and his personal care attendant, and this gentleman that I knew he had really involved physically cerebral palsy, and so he would just move his head, and he was in a wheelchair, and he had this little, I guess game or whatever, that we were in the supermarket, and the staff, personal care attendant, pilfered a caramel for him. So then I'm like, oh my gosh, first of all, it's like stealing at the store, but then the man that I was working with, the man with an intellectual disability, CP, started choking. And of course, I'm, thinking about, oh my goodness, this is all I need. And of course, part of it is like, oh, my dissertation is going to go down the drain. This person's going to die, choke, and die. How am I going to explain that? But the thing about the man with cerebral palsy, he had a really strong cough reflex. And it was so important to him. His intellect was such that it was more valuable for him to be able to do these things pull the wool over the store's eyes, do all these things. For his self-esteem, he really wanted to do that. I mean, he would drink too, even though, although we didn't have to worry about driving. But, you have to kind of look at that. And it's the person that, his attendant who was with him knew him really well, and the man trusted his attendant, and knew that, and I'm sure he had choked a lot, and this is even considering that he was married to a woman with CP, who they both decided they wanted to continue to eat despite, problems with dysphagia or choking. And in fact, his wife had died. She choked from a piece of chicken she was, eating, and died. So I think people, and you try to think about, well, how do people make decisions? And I look at what was important for this man. How do we rectify that? As healthcare practitioners. Because oftentimes I know, we would just say, well, this person's, doesn't have the capacity to make a rational decision, and we should get him a guardian so they can make these decisions for him. I mean, I think nowadays there are more, I don't know in Rhode Island, but in Massachusetts, the guardianship laws are much more carved out and are much more detailed and really looking at the different facets of a person's life. So how do we use, these different safeguards? And that was one of the things, is what kinds of safeguards in place? People are going to make, quote, bad decisions, no matter where or who. So what kinds of safeguards can we put in place with people? One of the things is a friend of mine who takes care of her goes up to Vermont with her 90-year-old aunt and uncle. She was telling me last night when I was talking about this. She said, well, they live kind of isolated. They're in a cocoon. See, they don't really want to be sort of noticed, because then people will come in and dissolve, take them away and dissolve the marriage. So they keep under the radar. And so I said, well, Maureen, and she feels like she gets a little nervous, but she goes up at least every month to see them. And I said, well, you're a safeguard. You know them. You know what's going on there in their world. Establishing relationships with other members of the family, with people up there. And you can kind of try to help to support them in the choices that they make. And I think this is a hard thing, because we all do. When you care about somebody and really worry about them, and and for us as healthcare practitioners, we're always worried about, what legally, and how is this going to look, and the law, and and I hate to say this newspaper, we can't help on how that affects the way that we support people. So what I'm trying to say is that we really need to kind of look at all of these things and kind of support people. And it's interesting for me, because being a nurse, safety, I'm really focused about safety, but it's a broader world, and I think unfortunately, it makes it much more difficult for those of us who are healthcare practitioners to support people, because it's not an easy black white. It's those shades of gray between that really govern how people. All of us lead our lives, and you do know what happens if people make, quote, poor decisions, or decisions we wouldn't want to have. So, I mean, we do get nervous about risky things. And so, how do we increase these kinds of things and learn to work with people and draw on experiences with people to make it worthy? So, because I'm really fast. So, I have some resources for your next slide. And there's a lot of things out there about risk. There's a lot of the UK has a lot of information. In fact, there's this looking at risk, trust, and relationships in an aging society. That's available for free. You can download it and give you the website. So I think we need to just kind of, sometimes things are in a hurry, and I get that, but it's like sometimes we have to kind of take a broad picture of what's going on. And even though, when I looked at what the goals of the presentation, the third goal of comparing and contrasting everyday strategies, what I wanted to do is to give you some sort of, just a different framework to look at things, and giving you much more sort of, not ammunition, but when you come at work into some supports and strategies, when you work to support, I keep using those words, but try to help people to make decisions that may be the most healthy for them. I guess that's it. So, we're going to have questions after.
Thank you.
Attorney Sjoberg has developed a very respected reputation in Rhode Island as an expert in the field of estate planning, probate practice, and estate and trust litigation. His practice is concentrated on this area of the law with special emphasis on protection of the elderly and disabled.
I really want to talk about what can and can't be done, what we try to do as, from the legal perspective. What institutions we can count on and some that we can't, why that is and what we do about it. So I think first we need to look at the fact that who is our audience, who is people who are looking for our services or need our services, whether they appreciate it or not. And what are the human problems that we see just because someone wants to be independent? So they may have dementia, they may have been susceptible to undue influence, they may have a lot of problems, but the first thing they want to make sure is that they have their independence. And as they proceed to further go down that slope of not having requisite capacity to make decisions for themselves, they do everything in their power to make sure that no one else knows about it, that they can hide it somehow and continue to function in life. And it's at that point where they're the most vulnerable. It's where people who know of them or have befriended them, or those in their family who are looking at their property and their inheritance, can really get to a point where they now control this individual's life and the individual themselves. So what are the problems that we face in the legal profession when we're dealing with cases of this type? One is the individuals themselves, and I've alluded to it. In other words, this is the individual themselves that we're talking about, and what they suspect, what they're suspicious of. What we find mainly is that a person does not want to talk, does not want to open up if they feel that anything that they say is going to betray the fact that they don't have all their faculties, that they may not be able to make informed decisions for themselves, even with proper advice. And when we go into a home, let's say, and we prefer to do it at home as opposed to trying to get someone to bring them to the office, because hopefully they'll feel more comfortable in that environment. But even then, we'll find that someone will either refuse to say a word or try to monopolize the conversation from beginning to end. We call it the filibuster, but we are faced with individuals who either don't want to say anything because they know that they can't put together a cogent sentence or express what they're feeling to you, perhaps to your satisfaction, or you get the individual who won't stop talking. Doesn't matter what they're talking about, they won't stop talking because they want to fill the air and prevent you from asking any questions. And you'll figure at some point in time you'll just give up and go away. There are individuals who will use changing subjects as a tool. You'll talk about this and it'll remind them of something else, and before you know it, we're going down this road, we started down this road. Sometimes they get angry at being questioned if they think they're being questioned or interrogated. Usually we get a reaction like, I have my rights. Well, they're not being arrested, and they don't have those rights. We're not trying to take away their civil rights. What we're trying to do is help them, and we can't do it without establishing a line of communication. So sometimes we have had longer sessions with people such as this than we do with clients coming into the office to have an estate plan done, for example, where they know what they want, they know what they have, they know who they want to give it to, and probably in a half-hour interview, we can get all that information down and then proceed with the plan. When we're going to their home, sometimes they're not quite sure why you're there, why they're being questioned, particularly if you're doing it as part of a legal proceeding. Let's say that there's a guardianship petition pending. Many times I've been appointed guardian ad litem, which means guardian of them for the purposes of this case. And the job is to find out, do they need help? If so, what help? Do they have less restrictive alternatives in place now? Is there a power of attorney around? Do they have other people that they depend on for helping them and carrying out their decisions? And a lot of times what ends up happening in that first conversation is nothing more than they want to convince you that they haven't done anything wrong. And what ends up happening is that you have to use anything that you have in common. Now, this is Rhode Island, okay? So quite often we can talk to people and you're looking around for the fish on the wall or the map on the wall or something that indicates what their interests are. And by the way, we're supposed to be meeting these individuals alone, which also creates a degree of tension, because maybe the caregiver who's sitting there wants to answer the questions for them because they may know the facts better than they do, but I'm trying to get it from them. I'm trying to find out what they know and what they can communicate with me. And maybe it's the caregiver who's the problem. Maybe it's the caregiver who, with the right motives even, won't let them communicate, won't let them make decisions for themselves, won't let them read the paper because they're afraid of them learning something or getting upset. And it's one of the first things that we see. The antenna goes up, we see circumstance in home. The other type is when an individual is already within the definition of having dementia. Some are unable to communicate because they have a mental disease. So we don't necessarily expect to get information from them that we can use to help them. So why would we bother with the communication? Why would we bother trying to talk to them? And even though it won't produce reliable information necessarily, because we can't help them in terms of their dementia, we can't help them in terms of their medical care, but what they say may give us evidence of the disease or the defect that we'll be able to use in a court proceeding. So even if we can't get reliable information, we might get information that shows their suspicion of others. It may show that they are particularly concerned about a certain problem. They're concerned about medicine, or they're concerned about who their doctor is and when they've last seen them, and didn't like what they heard the last time they were in the doctor's office. So the individual is our primary concern, and yet it takes some special handling to make sure that they don't get upset beyond what they're going to anyway, and that we are able to gather information, documentation, information about people that they have relationships with to get a clue as to what's going on in their world. Keep in mind also, you made a joke about Rhode Island, but sometimes their world may be their room, and they never come out of it. So that's the only relevant world that we need to look at. Sometimes it's the house. Maybe they live with family who's moved in to take care of them, but they have a certain corner of the house that's theirs. That's where we want to go, and that's what we want to look at. Sometimes they have friends and associations, and they like to hang out with their friends. So it may be at the golf course, even though they can't play golf anymore. It may be at the local restaurant where they go to have coffee in the morning. A lot of times we have to go and follow them. I mean, follow them in the sense of go with them or meet them, so we can see them in their environment. And again, that is going to tell us a whole lot more than questioning them about it, because they'll get defensive about the questioning about their favorite, say bar, but their favorite coffee house or restaurant for lunch, or where they meet their friends. But you really can't ask those questions without raising their suspicions. But if you meet them there, if you can find out a little bit about what their world is, their associations, you're going to know a whole lot more about them interacting with their peers, but you're also going to get some witnesses, perhaps, that can help us understand what's going on. Undue influence is a big part of this. Individuals who have an idea, probably more than they should, about what the individual owns, what they have in the bank, what insurance policies they have, and so forth, and their friend wants to help. There's a lot of ways of getting that help legitimately, but when the individual is taken to the bank and suggested that maybe I can help you with your banking, so maybe my name needs to be on your account so I can go and make deposits for you, withdraw money for you if you need it. And what's just happened is something we call undue influence, where they've used position in order to influence an individual to make a decision that they wouldn't otherwise have made. The law is a funny thing sometimes. We can't treat a problem seriously until we give it a fancy Latin name. So we call these people interlopers. Okay? Sometimes we call them officious intermeddlers. But the law is trying to address these circumstances, even if they give them crazy names. What's happened is the courts hear enough of these cases that they approach the legislature to say, you know, we're the law in terms of enforcing what's on the books. And we can't make up law to deal with these situations, because a lot of times these situations and the people who are behind them are far ahead of what the law is, where the law is. So it needs legislation. And as soon as the legislators get their hands on them, and some of my best friends are legislators, they have to be, because I need to go to the State House to lobby for legislation. But what ends up happening is they need to understand the problem so that they can define it in the statute. And then they need to either create a penalty for the people who are guilty in these circumstances, or that they will allow or give certain organizations or entities or agencies of government the power to deal with it themselves. I'll talk a little bit later about the Department of Elderly Affairs role and the excuse me, the Long-Term Care Ombudsman. Both deal with this problem, and the jurisdiction depends on where the person is. So the Department of Elderly Affairs deal with people in the community, in other words, in their home, and the Ombudsman takes care of those who are in facilities, so nursing homes, hospitals, and the rest. But their role is exactly the same. When someone sees a problem and the whistle gets blown, whether it's in the community or in an institution, they can go and investigate. They have the power under the statute to waive the individual's confidentiality to be able to find out what's going on. They can get bank records, they can get medical records. They maintain confidential to the investigation, but at least somebody is looking at it. And then usually what happens is the court process will get involved again, because if the individual does not have their own power of attorney or their own will or estate plan, things that they should have in place, perhaps guardianship is necessary, or custodianship. And that's where each local city or town probate court will come in. And a lot of times the petitioner will be the Department of Elderly Affairs or the Ombudsman. But again, it is trying to deal with these people who are sticking their nose in where it doesn't belong, and the motivation is so clear. It's surprising that you even have to go to court to prove the case. You should smell a rat right from the get-go. And, you know, sometimes I feel that I've been doing it too long because I feel like I can see it around every corner, and I don't want to judge people that way. So I do reserve judgment, but after 37 years of practice doing this, I think I have a pretty good sense of who's there to help because they're there to help, and who's there to fatten their own accounts. And, you know, a lot of times, it used to be that the banks were a whole lot more cooperative with us than they are now, because they're afraid of what's going to be found. And because the smaller banks that used to be cooperative, the neighborhood banks, because they knew who we were and who the individual was in the community, and they saw them in the bank all the time, frankly, it was the banks that used to call them, blow the whistle when they saw someone come along to the bank and help them. Something just didn't seem right. They'd call the police. They would call an agency of government. And that's the way it should be. Right now, we have a community where small banks have been eaten up by large banks, and the large banks set the policies, protocols. So now you've got a company like Santander that now owns the former sovereign banks and whatever else that they can bring in. And what they want to avoid is what? They don't want to defame anybody. They don't want to accuse anybody of a crime or what may be a crime. So they're just as happy to have the client and have their money, have it on account. But if someone comes in and has a piece of paper that allows them to bank for the other person, they give themselves cover. It's a shame. That's the world we now live in, and it hasn't been that way for perhaps for maybe the last 3 years. We've seen it more and more. Joint holding of assets is another one. It's where people commingle money, but a lot of times, most of the money is the person who's got the mental deficiency, who can't make decisions for themselves, so the money gets commingled with others, and now it's our money, and it's with joint tenancy, so which is more likely to predecease the other? You know, more likely the other. And from that, you get the question of, is this account a joint account with right of survivorship, or is it a tenancy in common where each holder has a 50% interest, and the 50% interest that belongs to the elder still passes through their estate? We ran into such problems with joint accounts because they weren't defined in law. They were defined in banking policy. And each bank had their own set of terms about, this is, if the two of you, you and your friend open an account, put money in it, and two of your names are on it, but it doesn't say with right of survivorship, it's considered a tenants in common. Okay? So there are as many shares as there are people on that account. So they could halves, thirds, fourths, whatever. The courts weren't going to impose a right of survivorship unless it said it on the bank account. Judge Borsier, who was he's passed some years now, but he was a trial judge, one of the toughest trial judges in the Superior Court, and then he got elevated to the Supreme Court. And a lot of these cases came to him when he was a trial judge, so he heard the witness, he saw the witnesses, he saw the evidence, and he was very hard on this idea that trying to identify who was the real holder of the funds. And usually he went along with the first person on the count and whose social security number is on it. I'll go with that. And if I'm wrong, but I'm still going to go with that. Following that career in the Superior Court, he ended up in the Supreme Court. And he said, this is one of his lines in one of his decisions. There are two ways of starting a lawsuit in the state of Rhode Island. One is to file a complaint with the Superior Court, and the other is to open a joint bank account. And he wrote a dozen decisions in the Supreme Court explaining what the rules should be, how they should work, how people can protect themselves in this process. And what ended up happening, the legislature took it upon themselves to define the terms, and what it really is now is a menu that you can virtually do anything. There's actually a joint tenancy without right of survivorship. Who knew? It was left to the legislature. We also have a problem, it's not a problem societally, it's a problem in these situations of property and people becoming incapacitated. And it's second marriages and mixed families. It used to be that we could tell in families that it was one marriage, their kids, non, and that's how we learned how property got disposed of when someone passed. We learned the line of inheritance. Well, now the line of inheritance is like this. We don't know who is now next of kin. We have marriages that have stayed together for convenience, but the parties don't live together. But you may have a child who lives in the house and is providing for the upkeep and maintenance of the home and for the upkeep and care of the decedent. And what you see happening is the race of the mixed family, let's put it this way, to the probate court once they find that someone has died. Because it may not have been, I hate to sound jaded, but it just seems more than not that people who had very, very little to do with the senior while they were alive, particularly in their later years when they're most needed, they're the first ones lining up the probate court to find out where they stand in the world. So, again, I do this all the time, so I guess I have the right to say I'm jaded because I've seen that much of that. In any event. And then there's also planning. It is not difficult to go to an attorney. And unfortunately, you have to go to an attorney or some agency that has attorneys on staff to do an estate plan. And the reason for that is, some time ago, it was defined as the practice of law. was one of those things that only lawyers could do. Now, we know that insurance salesmen do them, we know that bankers do them, we know that there are private individuals associated with accountants that do them, but they generally, once they've done the plan, run it by the lawyer they have on staff to say, yeah, it comports with Rhode Island law. Because you want to make sure that it cannot be defaulted simply because it was the product of the unauthorized practice of law. So, what happens when you've got this unusual family situation? Who gets involved? It can't just be lawyers. It can't just be the family. I want to share with you, I'll leave with this because it's going to take a little time to lay out the fact pattern, but I was involved in a case that was 7 years old when it started. I should say that. It was 7 years ago when it started. And the individual that this is about just recently passed. We had a woman who was elderly. By the way, in preparing for this session, I reread some of the statutes just for homework. And I found out at my last birthday I became elderly. 60 years old. I know some very healthy 60-year-old people. I try to be one of them. My wife would kill me if I didn't go to the gym with her 3 times a week. But that's the break-off point now. That's the elderly population, and the percentage of the population that is 60 years and older is growing every single year. Okay? So it's one of these things where people have to keep their eye out for this growing population because they don't just need protection because they turn 60. They need someone looking out for them because how many more years do they have left? And there are people out there that are trying to take advantage, and they could be within the family or outside the family because of that fact. We tend, I shouldn't say we because I'm a lawyer, most 60 years and older tend to trust people. It's a fact. That when they get burned the first time, they're ashamed of themselves. Really. They're ashamed of themselves because they trusted you. And that's why they're victims. That's why they're targets. But what ended up happening in this case was this elderly woman had a number of medical issues, medical problems. And her family talked her into staying away from nursing homes and assisted living facilities and all of those. She lived in an area where there were a good number of them. As a matter of fact, more of these facilities are being built in South County, Washington County, because it's a lot of land to use to do it. And so there are brand new facilities down there with very good staffs, and she would have been with her peers and had activities and wouldn't be dependent on anybody else. She would be just paying for those services. Well, she didn't have children, but it was her nieces and nephews that were assigned to take care of her in her house by her sister who lived next door. Long story short, as far as the opening chapter, they were more concerned about getting their hands on her property and her money than they were in taking care of her. And word got out that she was spending most of her day wrapped in a quilt on the couch watching TV. And they had a milkman. And the milkman noticed that the stuff that she used to get, and she used to love drinking milk and all the rest, was going down in quantity. Couldn't figure out why. And she used to come to the door when he dropped off because there was a person to talk to. And she wasn't coming to the door and couldn't figure it out. So they ended up contacting both the Department of Elderly Affairs and the Ombudsman. Because she was living at home, it was a DEA case. Police were notified. Fire department was notified because they have the rescue. And what ended up happening was they were told of what the suspicion was. And they came to the door, first the policeman, with a rescue out front, and asked to be let in. And whoever was behind the door refused to do it. And the officer then said, "We're going to break down the door if you don't open it, and let us in." So the door creaked open. They found her on the couch in the quilt. And they asked the rescue driver to come in, put her on a gurney, and take her out, take her to the hospital for just a, I don't know what you would call it now. Yeah, I mean, trying to find out if she was okay, not knowing what her problems were, if any. But there was enough suspicion for them to want to do it, plus that they got the report from the DEA. Once she got to the hospital, it was found out that she had ulcers to the bone. And she was hospitalized for a good period of time. And then one sister came to the hospital with a healthcare power of attorney that said that she didn't want to be kept alive by extraordinary means. Another relative, not a sister, but another relative, came to the hospital with another power of attorney that said just the opposite. And they were drawn relatively close together. And they were drawn by attorneys. So the hospital council filed a suit in Superior Court and asked the judge for instruction. Tell us which power to use. Are we to ignore both because we can't authenticate them? Are we to take the latest one? That would seem logical, that it would reverse the prior one. So they had a hearing. And I was contacted by the judge to come in because she wanted me to get involved in the case. She didn't know at that point what capacity yet, but she needed to have someone who was going to follow the court's instructions, and she didn't like what she heard about this case so far. So we ended up, I asked the hospital council to get pictures of the wounds. Because I knew from my discussion with the judge that she didn't know what a decubitus ulcer was. And she was having difficulty reading the medical report. So that afternoon we had a session. And I went in and put the photos on her desk. She was doing it in chambers because she didn't know yet how much courtrooms are public. so people can just come in and sit down in the back and hear whatever's going on. This was one where she wanted to preserve confidentiality as long as she could. She looked at the pictures and said, I can't believe this. Called the police to arrest the two that were in the house with her. She appointed me a temporary guardian. It turned out that the South Kingstown Probate Court was meeting that afternoon. So the judges got together and appointed me as temporary guardian out of the probate court, so that would have muster long past the Superior Court's jurisdiction in the case. Because once they had made the order of arrest and so forth, their job was essentially done. Superior Court's job was going to go on for a while. So the court issued injunctions against the family. They asked the two individuals who were on the powers of attorney to resign. And they did. Because they were also going to be talking to the police later on. So they didn't want there to be any ulterior motive suggestion. What ended up happening is that I have served as her temporary guardian for 60 days and her permanent guardian for the next 7 years. She was put in a nursing home, Kent Regency, because my office is in Warwick, and it was easier to do that and keep her away from the influence that was happening with the family in South Kingston. Periodically, we would have meetings with the hospital staff where they'd say, well, what about her quality of life? You can't be the judge of that. The judge threw out the powers of attorney, so with it went the powers to cut short her life, to withdraw life support. I would have periodically, they would have, like in most nursing homes, quarterly meetings where they discuss the patients and how they're coming. And usually one of the agenda items, at least the meetings I was invited to, was why can't we have instruction from the court that we're not to keep her alive by extraordinary means? I said, you can't, first of all, you can't do it because she didn't say it, that's her choice. Number two, talk to me about what you see when you go into the room. Talk to me about what happens. Well, it turns out that the administrators weren't seeing much of anything. They were going in and seeing that it was a very sick woman who needed complete manipulation in bed. She needed to be propped up. She was on a liquid diet, and her point was, is that life? Well, it's not life to me, and if I thought that that was in my future, I would draw a power to make sure that that didn't happen. But I'd also make sure that there was someone who could withdraw life support, that there was someone who could make those decisions, not the hospital, not the nursing home. But then I would ask her nurses, and she said, tell me, when you come into the room, do you think she recognizes you? And they're looking at each other then, and they said, yeah, she smiles. I said, so what does that tell you? You know, is there someone who understands what you're doing for her? Anyway, she bounced back and forth between the nursing home and the hospital. And every time the hospital wanted to release her, they would only do it with an order that said that they could terminate her life by, even if she couldn't express herself. And I had no problem, and the director of the nursing home had no problem if she died by natural causes in the hospital. We didn't have to have extraordinary procedures done. A lot of times it was pneumonia, and she could be kept comfortable, and it might have taken. But it was fascinating to me that I would okay the orders that the doctors were looking for. She always pulled through, and then made the trip back to the nursing home. So in her last illness, it's what happened. She came back to the nursing home, but they weren't going to release her unless she was being followed. And the understanding was that they thought her death was going to be fairly soon. So they had someone come and watch her for 3 days in a row. And then they decided, well, maybe we'll do it twice a week. And then maybe once a week. And then maybe twice a week. And then maybe once a month. And then they stopped. Because she was still alive and she was still getting her services at the nursing home. She passed 2 months ago. And I still go back to what the court was looking at 7 years ago. Can't believe people could be with it. Questions?